Visuals and Down syndrome, the why and the how. Hi, I'm Marla and I'm an SLP at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation in BC, Canada. In this video, we are going to discuss visuals, why we so often want to use them with our people with Down syndrome, and how they're helpful. So this video will discuss the why and the how of visuals. The purpose of this video is for parents and teachers and other supporters to really understand how these can be used and what the most effective way to choose and use a visual would be. Specifically, I am going to discuss why visuals are a good fit for Down syndrome in particular, and how you could go about choosing a visual that would be right for you. So let's first talk about what a syndrome is. We know that a syndrome is a cluster of symptoms that affect multiple body systems. The body systems that we're concerned with today are hearing, vision, the function of the brain in terms of learning and memory and sensory processing, the function of our mouth in terms of motor control, and the function of our hands in terms of motor control. Down syndrome affects all of these things, so let's talk about each system one at a time. We know that for people with Down syndrome, hearing loss is a big issue. It could be seasonal or permanent, but regardless of that, it makes it harder to hear all of the sounds that are in words. On top of that, there are frequent ear infections to deal with. We see an increase in something called auditory processing disorder, which means that the information that the ear takes in isn't organized as well by the brain. These hearing challenges are hard to correct fully, even with the use of hearing aids, and that piece is important. Let's compare that with vision, which may also be affected by that extra 21st chromosome. There's an increase in the chance of having cataracts and also the need for glasses. However, in comparison with hearing, vision issues are more correctable, meaning that visual processing is a strength for people with Down syndrome when compared to auditory processing. Let's consider the brain. So as we've discussed, there might be auditory processing issues or visual processing issues, and certainly there are some challenges with learning and memory that mean that a person with Down syndrome needs more repetition to learn. In relation, speech is something that I've talked about before. We can summarize it by saying that speech is a very difficult and it's a parasitic function, meaning that breathing and eating come before speech always in terms of importance. I would recommend watching our speech video for more details on why speech is particularly difficult. The last body system that we're going to discuss today in relation to visuals is the use of the hands. And the important piece to know here is that the coordination and accuracy of someone's hands often develops before the coordination and accuracy of their mouth for speaking. Okay, so we've talked about the body systems that are involved in making visuals a good fit. Let's discuss why do visuals work well for people with Down syndrome. Okay, so what we know is that vision for people with Down syndrome is sort of a stronger sense than hearing. It's more reliable and more correctable than hearing. We discussed how people with Down syndrome may have intermittent hearing loss, but they do not have intermittent vision loss in most cases. Another thing that makes visuals a good fit for people with Down syndrome is that they allow for more time for cognitive processing. In other words, more time to think about what's being told in a visual sense and understand it well. In relation, visuals allow somebody to essentially have repetition. They can look and refer to the visual as many times as needed so that they can learn more easily. Another thing in relation to the brain is the reduction of stress, anxiety, and the increase in consistency because you can refer back to a visual and use the same visual across multiple environments like home, school, or even in the car. So the three things I've just discussed are in relation to how the brain of a person with Down syndrome benefits from the use of visuals. Let's discuss another aspect, which is the stress on you, the supporter, parent, or teacher. By using visuals, you are decreasing the number of times that you will need to repeat yourself, which, as we all know, nobody likes to nag. The last area that I'm going to discuss here is the use of the hands, and the motor system of moving your hands is easier for people with Down syndrome than moving their mouths. So by using a visual, you are providing an opportunity for the individual with Down syndrome to respond more easily than they would if they had to say the words. The next piece we're going to discuss is how to use visuals, because it's one thing to say, oh, people with Down syndrome are visual learners, and it's another thing to understand how you can make visuals work for you and the student with Down syndrome. As with all of these sort of primer videos that we've been making, I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. We're going to break this down into 3 steps: pick it, make it, and use it. First one that I'm going to talk about here is the use of sign language, sometimes called ASL, sometimes called baby signing. And I'm talking about this first because it's usually the first question that parents come to me with when their children are quite young. So essentially, you first need to decide if this is something you want to do, and then you need to make time to do it for you and your child. There's no point in using sign language if only the child learns it, because they can't communicate that with you. You can choose to use videos or classes to develop your sign language skills. And then in order to use sign language, you're going to choose one situation to start where you're going to try and include some signs, and slowly over time expand to more situations. Next, we're going to talk about visuals in the way that I think most people consider it, which is images or objects. And we're going to consider these in a continuum from very concrete to very symbolic. The first we'll discuss is using objects. This is certainly the most concrete. You would either use the full object or a part of the object to represent what you're trying to say. This could be holding up one shoe and saying it's time to put on your shoes. The shoe you're holding is the object visual that you're using to support what you're saying with words. Essentially, what you need to do is point to the object that you're using, say the important keyword, and give your student or child time to respond, and repeat yourself after about 10 seconds or so if you feel like they need to hear it again. The next type of visual along this continuum that we'll talk about is using photos. Photos are still fairly concrete. They give a very clear representation of what you're talking about. And this is an area that I like to start in when I'm beginning to use visuals with a student to see if it works well. What you need to do is find, print, and organize your pictures in a way that you can access them quickly and easily. This might be using Velcro, or it might be hole punching them and putting them on a ring, etc. Essentially, the way that you're going to use this is the same. You're going to point the word, say the key word, and give your student time to respond. Similar to photos, drawings are another form of visual that's a little bit more abstract because they are symbolic representations of the physical item. So in the same way that you'd use photos, you need to find, print, and organize your drawings. You can draw them yourself as well. That totally works as long as your drawings can clearly represent what you're trying to communicate. And these need to be organized by printing or putting them on a ring, etc. The way that you're going to use them is the same. You're going to say your key word while pointing to the important visuals. The last type of visual we will discuss is also the most symbolic, and that is written words. That's what most adults use as their functional visuals to help them remember things, such as to-do lists, etc. So you could either type and print this kind of visual, or you could write it out on the spot. Of course, this kind of visual requires that your student knows how to read. That's the important piece there. The application or the way to use this kind of visual is the same. You're going to write out your keywords. There's a type of visual that combines both drawn symbols and written words. And this is what we usually think of as sort of Boardmaker or other AAC apps or devices that have a picture and a word close together in the form of sort of a button. These are helpful because they sort of make a bridge for the student who might be relying more on drawn images, but working towards higher literacy and using words as a visual. Let's just some considerations for how we make visuals and the choices that we need to make going into that. The first thing that needs to be considered is the size of the visuals. We need something that the student can see clearly. Bigger is bulkier, so it's not always great to go huge, but if you go too small, then it's not really functional. The next thing, as I mentioned, is how concrete or abstract your visuals need to be. I like to start with photos. If you're wondering where to start, that's a good place. Or you can try drawings, but recognize that you may need to move a step backwards. Next thing to consider is how many visuals you're going to present at once. It makes a big difference if you're going to present just one picture or two pictures versus a whole grid of pictures. I would certainly recommend starting simple with one or two rather than presenting several at once. What we don't want to have happen is for a student to become overwhelmed by visuals and then refuse them altogether as a strategy. Okay, let's break down step number 3 a little bit more, which is the use of visuals, because I'm sure some people are wondering, but how do I get started in using visuals? I would absolutely recommend that you consult with your SLP for help in getting started with using visuals. However, if you don't have access to an SLP, I'm going to try and break it down a little bit here so that you can feel confident in getting started. Essentially, there's 2 different situations you could choose. One, where your student would need to make a choice, or 2, where you're trying to help your student follow one or several instructions. The first thing that you're going to do is decide how many options are you going to present. This relates to the information right above. Is it going to be one or several? You are going to hold up the visual, whether it's photos or drawings, and ask your question. Do you want, for example, apples or cheese? While you say the word, you're going to point to the image one at a time. You're going to make sure that this is within sight of the student, and then you're going to give some time. Now, your student could respond in several different ways. They may look at the one that they choose, they may point to it, or they may say the word themselves or an attempt to say something like apple. Any of these are great as an indicator of their choice, and it means that the visual is quote-unquote working. Let's consider the other situation of wanting to help your student follow one or several instructions. So what you want to do in this situation is largely the same. You are going to present your visual within sight of the student and tell them what's going to be happening next. You need to wait until your student makes eye contact with the visual so that you know that they have at least noticed it. You may need to repeat yourself again. Giving more wait time is always a good thing. If you're not sure if it's long enough, wait a little bit longer. Sometimes we want to show a student the order of the things in their day or when something really special might be happening. So again, you're going to do the same thing and present it nice and slowly. All of the visuals that we have been discussing here fall under the large umbrella of something called AAC, or Augmentative Alternative Communication. This video is actually a form of AAC where you might be understanding better the information I'm trying to share because there's audio and visual as well. AAC is really anything aside from just talking to somebody. We usually break it down into both low tech and high tech. Most of what we discussed so far is low tech. This could be things like pictures, objects, signing, communication binders, or even core vocabulary boards. On the other side of things, we have high-tech AAC, which might be devices or apps, or other things like eye gaze technology. You may have heard of some of the communication apps that are out there, things like ProLoco to Go, Touch Chat, Go Talk Now, and there's several more like LAMP. I'm not even going to list them all, there's tons. What I really want to emphasize here is that either kind of visual is going to be helpful. One thing I hear a lot is, oh, but they already talk. And there are several reasons why you still want to use visuals even if your student is talking. Think about how you still use visuals even though you can talk. You make yourself lists, etc. Visuals for students who talk provide the following kinds of support. First, they're a memory aid. Our students can't always remember what they wanted to say. Second, they are a physical aid. Some words are difficult to pronounce, or a student may stutter and it may be difficult to understand them. A student might have something like CAS, childhood apraxia of speech, and certainly they have a speech delay and sometimes a disorder as well. Sometimes students perseverate, and that means they get stuck saying the same thing over and over again, and an AAC, or a visual, might help them get out of that. AAC visuals are also a language aid. They show how language is organized and how words can be put together. You may have noticed that often AACs have a color coding system, and it's for this language building purpose. All of these 3 things combine together to make the big point, which is that AACs or visuals allow for more talking and more language. A lot of people have the sort of incorrect idea that using visuals or AAC will make your student talk less. It's absolutely not the case. Sometimes we use it as a bridge until your student becomes more confident, and sometimes we use it long term. This video is brought to you by the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation. Thanks for watching. You can visit our website to learn more.